At 11:30 hours on December 22, 1944, 4 German officers approached the American lines outside Bastogne, Belgium, carrying a white flag. They brought a formal surrender ultimatum from General Heinrich von Leutwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The message was direct. The American position was hopeless. Surrounded by 7 German divisions, no chance of relief, limited ammunition, and supplies. Surrender now with honor or face annihilation by German artillery and armor. The ultimatum was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. McAuliffe had been napping when his staff woke him with the German demand. He read it, looked at his officers, and said one word: nuts. His staff thought this was his initial reaction, not his formal response. But McAuliffe insisted. That was his official reply. Nuts. Send it back to the Germans exactly as stated. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard typed the response to the German commander. Nuts. The American commander. Colonel Joseph Harper delivered it personally. When the confused German officers asked what the word meant, Harper explained in clear terms, it means the same as go to hell. In plain English, it means no. McAuliffe's one-word response captured something fundamental about American military doctrine that had been developing for more than 2 decades, something that made American forces fight differently than any other army in the Second World War. When surrounded, most armies defended and waited for rescue. Americans counterattacked. Marshall had not forgotten the mud, the chaos, or the staggering inefficiencies he witnessed in 1918. He knew that the AEF had prevailed through courage, numbers, and industrial might, not through mastery of modern warfare. And he had spent the 2 decades that followed thinking about how to fix that from the moment he took office. Marshall set out to rebuild the army from the ground up. He began by attacking the institutional habits that had kept it stagnant. He slashed garrison paperwork, curtailed ceremonial routines, and insisted that officers who wanted to advance would do so through tactical competence, not social connections or seniority. He demanded honest assessments, blunt criticism, and freedom for subordinates to speak candidly, qualities he believed the Army had lacked in 1918, sometimes with fatal consequences. More importantly, Marshall understood that war in the 20th century was not won by individual branches operating in isolation. It was won by coordinated teams of infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air power, all maneuvering as a unified whole. To build such a force, he pushed for large-scale field exercises on a scale the peacetime army had never attempted. The Louisiana, Carolina, and Tennessee maneuvers that followed in 1940-41 were not just drills. They were laboratories where American tactical doctrine was broken down, rebuilt, and tested under near-combat conditions. Units marched hundreds of miles, divisions maneuvered against one another, and the Army began slowly to learn how to fight as a modern, mechanized force. Marshall also championed the rise of leaders who shared his vision. Men like Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, Joseph Stilwell, and George Patton, all officers who had been overlooked or sidelined under the old system, found their careers revived under his stewardship. Marshall believed they possessed the energy, intellect, flexibility required for the war he knew was coming, even if others doubted them. His eye for talent would shape every major battlefield of the Second World War. By 1941, the Army was still small, still under-equipped, and still learning, but it was no longer the hollow institution Marshall had inherited. It was becoming a force with a coherent doctrine, an emerging combined arms philosophy, and a cadre of leaders capable of executing it. The transformation was not yet complete, but the foundations had been laid. And when war finally came to the United States on December 7, 1941, those foundations would be tested in ways Marshall had anticipated and feared ever since the guns fell silent at the end of the First World War. Marshall believed that officers needed to learn how to think, not just how to follow checklists. At Fort Benning, he enforced a simple rule: the battlefield would never give a commander perfect information, so the classroom should not either. Students were given ambiguous situations, conflicting reports, and time limits that forced them to act. Hesitation was treated as a failure. Boldness, backed by sound, judgment was rewarded, He abolished the ornate sand table problems that had defined pre-war instruction and replaced them with realistic field exercises conducted in the woods, swamps, and rolling terrain around the post. Officers were pushed to lead small units under pressure, to improvise when plans fell apart, and to learn from their mistakes without fear of career-ending consequences. Marshall insisted that every critique be honest, direct, and unemotional. The purpose was improvement, not punishment. This environment forged a generation of officers who would later command American armies, corps, and divisions across the globe. Bradley would carry Marshall's lessons into North Africa and Europe, where his calm, methodical style helped steady inexperienced American formations. Ridgway would apply the same emphasis on initiative and adaptability when he led paratroopers into Sicily, Normandy, and Holland. Stilwell's insistence on tough, realistic training in the China-Burma India theater echoed the rigor he had absorbed at Benning. Even officers who had become Marshall's peers-like Patton respected the intellectual discipline he demanded. More importantly, Marshall's reforms created a cultural shift within the Army. Fort Benning became a place where questioning assumptions was not only permitted, but encouraged. Instructors challenged tradition. Students debated doctrine. Everyone was expected to explain why they made a decision, not simply repeat established formulas. This intellectual freedom was unprecedented in an institution that had long measured competence by seniority and memory. By the time Marshall left Fort Benning in 1932, he had built more than a school. He had built a mindset. A generation of officers now believed that war demanded flexibility, speed, and initiative at every level. When Marshall became Chief of Staff in 19, he carried that philosophy with him, and he now possessed the authority to apply it across the entire Army. The reforms of the late 1930s and early 1940s were not improvised reactions to global crisis. They were a deliberate extension of the pedagogy Marshall had pioneered at Fort Benning, scaled to an institution preparing for a world war. The army that went to battle in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific was shaped not only by industrial might, but by an intellectual revolution that begun in the pine forests of Georgia. They could seize the initiative before the enemy regained momentum. Hesitation, Marshall argued, allowed the attacker to reorganize, bring forward reserves, reposition machine guns, and turn a temporary penetration into a permanent breakthrough. Speed, not perfection, was the key to survival. Marshall's insistence on immediate counterattack was not reckless aggression for its own sake. It was a calculated response to the tactical realities he had studied in France. He had watched American units freeze when hit, waiting for clarification from brigade or division headquarters while local situations deteriorated. In the minutes lost to caution and communication, opportunities vanished. German stormtroopers exploited gaps, machine gun teams entrenched themselves, and what could have been a recoverable setback became a slaughter. At Fort Benning, Marshall drilled this lesson relentlessly. Students were repeatedly placed in scenarios where their units were surprised, flanked, or partially overrun. The expected response was always the same: regain the initiative. Officers were taught to rally whatever forces were immediately available platoons. Squads even scattered soldiers and launch a coordinated, violent counterstroke to stun and disrupt the enemy before he could stabilize. The goal was not necessarily to destroy the attacker outright, but to shatter his cohesion and force him onto the defensive. This emphasis on aggressive action flowed naturally from Marshall's broader philosophy. War, as he saw it, punished passivity. Units that waited, units that deferred decision-making upward, units that sought the comfort of certainty, those units died. He believed deeply that American soldiers, if properly trained and properly led, had the intelligence, adaptability, and raw courage to outfight any opponent. But leadership had to empower them. Officers had to be more than conduits for orders. They had to be thinkers and fighters capable of shaping the battlefield on their own initiative by instilling these principles in the next generation of commanders. Marshall was preparing the U.S. Army for a type of warfare far more fluid and decentralized than the trench-bound stagnation of 1918. He understood something that many military Institutions of the interwar period did not. Modern battle unfolded too quickly, too chaotically, and over too wide an area for control to reside solely at the top. Victory would depend on aggressive junior leaders who could seize fleeting opportunities within minutes and out hours. The doctrine that emerged from Fort Benning during Marshall's tenure would become the intellectual foundation for the American way of war in World War II. It shaped how battalions fought in North Africa, how companies maneuvered in the hedgerows of Normandy, and how platoons responded to Japanese assaults in the Pacific. Long before the shooting started, Marshall had already begun transforming an underprepared constabulary army into a force capable of waging modern, mobile, offensively minded warfare. They had to look at the ground, interpret the situation, make a decision, and communicate it immediately. Marshall believed that this was the essence of combat leadership, the ability to think clearly while under pressure, to impose order on chaos, and to act decisively. When the cost of hesitation could be measured in lives, the tactical walk became the defining ritual of Fort Benning. Students came to dread it not because it was physically demanding, but because it exposed every weakness in their judgment, confidence, and clarity of thought. There was no time to hide behind doctrine, no opportunity to craft polished solutions. An officer either understood the problem and acted, or he faltered. And if he faltered at Benning, Marshall wanted him to falter there, where the cost was embarrassment, not the death of his men. Marshall also changed the way instructors evaluated performance. Instead of focusing on whether a student chose the correct textbook solution, instructors graded the quality of the officer's reasoning. Did he issue orders quickly? Were they simple, clear, and executable? Did he use the terrain? Did he maintain momentum? Did his plan reflect an understanding that the battlefield punishes indecision more harshly than imperfect action? These standards were revolutionary in an army that had long rewarded meticulous planning and rigid adherence to established procedures. Marshall's Benning did not reject doctrine, but it refused to let doctrine become a crutch. Officers were expected to use principles as guides, not as excuses to delay or avoid making decisions. A commander who hesitated while searching for doctrinal perfection was, in Marshall's eyes, more dangerous than an enemy machine gun. The cumulative effect of these reforms was profound. Young officers began to internalize a new mental model of leadership, one that prized initiative, speed, and clarity. They learned that in war the situation would rarely be ideal. Instructions from higher headquarters might arrive too late to matter. Victory would depend on junior leaders, who could seize fleeting opportunities and act without waiting for permission. By the time Marshall left Fort Benning, he had forged a generation of officers who would carry this philosophy into the crucible of World War II, the tactical walk, the stripped-down decision exercises. The insistence on rapid orders, all of it, formed the intellectual backbone of the army that would fight in Tunisia, Normandy, the Bulge, the Philippines, and countless smaller battles. Long before the United States entered the war, Marshall had already begun reshaping an unprepared peacetime force into a flexible, offensively minded army capable of meeting the demands of modern combat. Under Marshall's system, officers were no longer passive recipients of doctrines. They were active problem solvers. Every field exercise, every tactical walk, every rapid decision drill was designed to build mental toughness and battlefield intuition. Marshall believed deeply that officers must experience stress in training so they would not be overwhelmed by it in combat. The mind, he often said, must be hardened before the body is tested. To enforce this philosophy, Marshall drastically reduced classroom hours. Lectures were short, direct, and immediately followed by practical application. If an instructor explained a principle in the morning, students spent the afternoon applying it under pressure in the field. The result was an immersive training environment where theory and practice were inseparable. Officers learned not through memorization, but through repeated exposure to real terrain, real constraints, and real urgency. These reforms also created a new kind of professional culture within the Army. Instructors were expected to challenge their students, not simply to teach them. After every exercise, critiques were blunt and unsparing. An officer whose plan was too slow, too complex, or too cautious was told so. But failure in training was treated as a necessary step in building competence. What mattered was improvement, adaptability, the willingness to learn. By the late 1930s, the cumulative effect of Marshall's reforms was unmistakable. The officers who had trained under him at Fort Benning Bradley, Ridgway, Stilwell, Collins, Clark, and many others were now senior instructors, battalion commanders, and regimental leaders across the Army. They brought with them the habits, expectations, and intellectual rigor Marshall had instilled. Across training camps nationwide, young officers were being taught to act rather than wait, to think rather than obey blindly, to seize initiative whenever opportunity appeared. In an army that was still small and chronically underfunded, this new mindset was one of the few advantages the United States possessed on the eve of World War II, while other nations clung to rigid, top-down command structures inherited from World War I. The U.S. Army was quietly cultivating a corps of officers trained to operate in the unpredictable, rapidly shifting conditions of modern battle. The transformation had begun at Fort Benning, but its effects would be felt across the beaches of North Africa, the hedgerows of Normandy, the jungles of New Guinea, and the islands of the Central Pacific. Marshall had fundamentally reshaped the intellect of the Army, preparing it for a war that demanded speed, initiative, and an aggressive spirit at every level of command. Men like Jacob Laux Devers, who pushed relentlessly for mechanization, modern armor doctrine, and the development of truly integrated combined arms formations. Men like Omar Nelson Bradley, whose calm, analytical leadership style complemented Marshall's emphasis on clarity and decisiveness. And men like Matthew Bunker Ridgway, who embodied the aggressive, initiative-driven ethos Marshall had cultivated at Fort Benning. These officers did not rise because of seniority, rose because Marshall believed they could fight the kind of war the United States would need to win. He understood that technology, resources, and industrial output mattered, but leadership mattered more. An army could be equipped with the best tanks, rifles, and aircraft in the world, but without officers who could think, adapt, and seize the initiative under fire, it would still fail. Marshall used his authority as Chief of Staff to reshape the leadership culture of the Army before a single American unit entered the war. He also imposed his training philosophy on the Army as a whole. Gone were the days of garrison routines and ceremonial drills. Marshall ordered large-scale maneuvers unlike anything the peacetime Army had ever attempted. The Louisiana, Carolina, and Tennessee maneuvers forced entire divisions and corps to move, maneuver, attack, and defend over hundreds of square miles. Communications broke down. Supplies ran out. Units became lost. Commands had to improvise. Exactly as Marshall intended. These exercises revealed weaknesses, sometimes humiliating ones, but they also developed leaders capable of making rapid decisions in uncertain, fluid environments. Officers who could not cope with the pressure were removed. Those who demonstrated initiative and adaptability were promoted. Marshall believed that it was better to expose the Army's deficiencies in the swamps of Louisiana than on the battlefields of North Africa or Europe. By 1941, the Army was still small, still growing, still experimenting, but it was no longer the static, procedure-bound force Marshall had inherited in 1939. It had become an institution infused with the spirit of Fort Benning. Think fast, act aggressively, seize the initiative, adapt to the unexpected. Junior officers were empowered to make decisions on their own authority. Commanders were encouraged to improvise rather than wait passively for orders. Training emphasized movement, firepower, combined arms rather than the rigid linear tactics of the First World War. Marshall had accomplished in 2 years what some believed would take a decade. He had transformed a constabulary army into the core of a modern fighting force. The weapons and soldiers were still arriving. But the mindset, the hardest thing, his change had already been reshaped. And when the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the officers Marshall had trained and selected would carry his philosophy into battle, shaping the way American forces fought across every theater of the conflict. Units that acted aggressively and moved decisively, consistently, outperformed units that hesitated or waited for perfect information. Formations that relied on rigid top-down control routinely found themselves outmaneuvered, cut off, or destroyed in simulated engagements. Junior officers who demonstrated initiative often succeeded, even when their plans were imperfect, while those who tried to adhere strictly to doctrine or await orders were overwhelmed by faster, more flexible opponents. The maneuvers also exposed significant weaknesses, exactly what Marshall hoped they would. Communication systems failed under the strain of large-scale operations. Supply lines collapsed when forced to support rapid movement. Armored and mechanized units frequently outran their infantry support. Anti-tank tactics were inconsistent. Coordination between air and ground forces was often poor. Many senior officers were unable to handle the complexity and speed of modern mobile warfare. Marshall used these shortcomings as evaluation tools. Officers who performed well were promoted rapidly. Those who failed were removed just as quickly. The maneuvers became, in effect, a national laboratory for testing the Army's leadership. One of the most famous results was the elevation of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had served as a planner and observer during the exercises. His ability to understand large-scale operations, integrate combined arms, and adapt to emerging conditions brought him to Marshall's attention and accelerated his rise. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Louisiana maneuvers was psychological. Soldiers and officers alike discovered that modern warfare demanded constant movement, improvisation, and resilience. Units marched for days, crossed rivers repeatedly, fought mock engagements in swamps and forests, and endured heat, rain, and exhaustion. The harsh conditions imposed a kind of realism that the Army had never before experienced in peacetime. As Marshall intended, training became a crucible, stressful, unpredictable, and unforgiving. By the time the exercises concluded, the Army had transformed. It was still a force in transition, badly equipped in many areas, and still inexperienced. But it had gained something far more valuable than equipment: confidence. Officers and enlisted soldiers now understood the tempo and demands of modern mobile warfare. They had learned how to improvise, how to maintain momentum, and how to make decisions in uncertainty. The maneuvers proved that the principles Marshall had developed at Fort Benning Speed, initiative, aggressive action, were not only viable, but essential. Marshall left Louisiana convinced that when the United States entered the war, as he knew it inevitably would, the Army would be ready not because it was fully armed, but because it was mentally prepared. Its leaders had been trained to think. Its soldiers had been trained to adapt. And its doctrine emphasized the offensive spirit Marshall believed was the key to survival. In victory in the coming conflict, supply units struggled to keep pace with fast-moving formations. Communications frequently broke down, leaving units isolated and forcing junior leaders to improvise. Many infantry commanders failed to coordinate effectively with armor, resulting in tanks outrunning their support or attacking without sufficient reconnaissance. Air-ground cooperation was often clumsy, with pilots unable to locate friendly units or interpret ground commanders' intentions. Anti-tank defenses were inconsistent, and many commanders underestimated the speed at which armored forces could penetrate their lines. To Marshall, these failures were not embarrassing, they were invaluable. The purpose of the maneuvers was to expose weaknesses in training, doctrine, and leadership before those weaknesses got soldiers killed in real combat. Every broken supply chain, every failed communications link, every mismanaged combined arms attack was a lesson that could be fixed in peacetime, rather than paid for in blood overseas. One of the most glaring problems was the quality of many senior officers. Some older commanders were simply unable to comprehend the demands of fast, fluid mobile warfare. They clung to static, methodical World War I-style tactics. They issued overly detailed orders that took too long to interpret. They tried to control every subordinate action from headquarters, rather than empowering junior officers to make decisions. These habits slowed units down, caused confusion, and allowed more aggressive opponents to seize the initiative. Marshall responded exactly as he had promised he would. He relieved them. Dozens of generals retired or were reassigned after the Louisiana maneuvers. Their places were filled by younger, or flexible commander's men who understood mechanization, combined arms, and rapid decision-making. Many of the officers who would later command American armies and corps in Europe and the Pacific earned Marshall's trust during these exercises. But the maneuvers did more than identify leaders. They shaped doctrine. The Army recognized the need for faster and more reliable communication, systems dedicated, logistics units capable of supporting rapid movement and improved air-ground coordination, procedures revised anti-tank tactics, and better distribution of anti-armor weapons, clearer command structures that pushed authority downward. Perhaps most importantly, the exercises validated the principle that initiative and offensive action were not just desirable, they were essential. Units that hesitated, units that waited for orders, units that clung to rigid defensive tactics were consistently defeated. Units that moved, attacked, outflanked, improvised, and counterattacked won by the end of the maneuvers. Marshall had proof that the Army could be reshaped into the force he envisioned, an army that could think fast, move fast, and hit hard. And with war approaching, there was no time to waste. The British Army entered the Second World War, a doctrine shaped by the trauma of the Somme and Passchendaele. Their manuals emphasized holding ground, maintaining cohesion, and relying on carefully prepared positions supported by artillery. The French army, still haunted by the bloodletting of 1914 to 1918, had gone even further, institutionalizing a methodical, deliberate, and strictly controlled approach to operations. Subordinate initiative was discouraged. Maneuver was limited. Commanders were taught that firepower and fortified positions, not movement, decided battles. Marshall rejected all of this. He believed the United States could not afford to fight the next war like the last one. America would rely on mass mobilization, on citizen soldiers who had only months to turn into effective fighting units. They would not have the years of experience, rigid discipline, or doctrinal reflexes of British or French regulars, but they could be trained to do something else, something uniquely suited to American strengths. They could be taught to act, to improvise, to move. Field Manual 1025 reflected this philosophy starkly. It stated that the goal of offensive action was not simply to capture ground, but to destroy the enemy's ability to resist. Maneuver, surprise, and speed were prioritized over rigid formations and predetermined sequences of fire. Junior officers were expected to act independently. Company commanders were told to exploit opportunities the instant they appeared. Patience was not a virtue. Waiting for permission was a liability. This doctrinal shift was profound. It meant that in the American Army of 1941, lieutenants were taught they should disobey orders when the situation demanded it. Captains were encouraged to maneuver around resistance rather than report it. Battalion commanders were expected to reshape battle plans on the fly. Higher headquarters would set the intent, not dictate every action. This doctrine empowered the kind of leaders Marshall was promoting, men like Eisenhower, Bradley Allen Harmon, and Collins, officers who instinctively sought movement over caution, decision over delay. But it also created tension with America's allies. British observers who attended the Louisiana Maneuvers were stunned by what they saw. American units launched attacks with minimal reconnaissance. Platoons separated widely in an effort to envelop enemy forces. Commanders shifted axes of advance with almost reckless speed. Radios crackled constantly as subordinates informed superiors of actions, already taken out, actions awaiting approval. To British eyes, it appeared chaotic, even undisciplined. To Marshall, it was a glimpse of the future. The Louisiana Maneuvers did not prove that the United States Army was ready for war. It wasn't. The logistics failures alone made that clear. But the maneuvers proved something more important. The core ideas worked. The doctrine was viable. The system of training could produce the kind of leaders Marshall believed would win a modern, fast-moving mechanized war. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States Army was far from fully prepared, but it was mentally aligned with the kind of war it would have to fight in North Africa, at Italy, and eventually France. The Army was not yet experienced, but it possessed something rarer at that early stage of the conflict, a doctrine of movement, aggression, an initiative that anticipated the kind of fight the Axis powers had already mastered. Marshall has given the U.S. Army a foundation. Now the war would test whether that foundation was strong enough. This principle, immediate action at the lowest level, was the defining feature of American doctrine. It assumed that battlefield opportunities were fleeting and that hesitation was more dangerous than a bold, imperfect response. Marshall's manual stated plainly that when the enemy attacked, the first responsibility of every commander was to seize the initiative back. A local threat was not something to report. It was something to solve. This expectation filtered all the way down to the smallest units. A platoon caught off guard was to push forward, flank, or counterpunch before the enemy consolidated. A company under sudden pressure was to strike back instantly, even if only with a squad or two. The purpose of these immediate counterattacks was not necessarily to retake ground. It was to disrupt the enemy, shatter his momentum, and keep him off balance. In effect, American doctrine sought to turn every firefight, every contact, to a contest for initiative. Whoever acted first and faster would dictate the terms of the larger battle. This stood in stark contrast to America's future allies. British, French, and Soviet forces viewed the battlefield as something to be shaped deliberately from above. An enemy penetration was a problem to be analyzed, resourced, and addressed with a coordinated plan executed by higher headquarters. American doctrine viewed such penetrations as time-sensitive, crises that had to be solved. Before they grew into larger problems, underlying, these differences were deeper cultural assumptions the British and French armies were built on. Professional officer corps with rigid hierarchies and deep institutional respect for procedure. Control was centralized because their systems valued predictability and coordination. The Soviet system centralized control even more tightly, partly from doctrinal tradition, partly from political necessity. Initiative at lower levels was discouraged because it threatened coherence. And in the Red Army of the 1930s and early 1940s, it could also threaten political reliability. The American Army was different. It was a citizen army by design. It was being built in a panic at unprecedented speed. From millions of civilians who lacked formal military experience but were accustomed to independence and civilian life, Marshall understood this. He believed that the strengths of American soldiers' initiative, improvisation, problem-solving had to be institutionalized rather than suppressed. Field Manual 1025 became the mechanism for doing that. Its message was simple. When in doubt, act. When attacked, strike back. When stalled, maneuver. When isolated, seize opportunity. Coordination, artillery preparation, and mechanized mass were all valuable, but none were substitutes for initiative at the point of contact. American doctrine saw the modern battlefield as too chaotic, too fluid, and too fast for centralized control to respond in time. This philosophy would come under fierce trial in North Africa, where American units, especially inexperienced ones, sometimes counterattacked too soon, too directly, or without adequate reconnaissance. But it would also prove decisive in countless small engagements, where a handful of junior leaders acting aggressively prevented localized setbacks from becoming operational disasters. Marshall had gambled that decentralized aggression, rather than rigid control, was the future of warfare. The coming months in Tunisia would test that belief on real battlefields against a German army whose doctrine prized initiative too, but whose battlefield experience far outweighed America's. Candidates were pushed from dawn until late at night, moving from classroom instruction to field problems to tactical exercises without pause. The goal was not merely to test endurance, though endurance was essential, but to force young officers to think clearly while exhausted, hungry, and under constant pressure. Marshall believed that if an officer could make sound decisions after 3 days without sleep at Fort Benning, he could make sound decisions after 3 days of combat in Tunisia or Normandy. The curriculum centered on decision-making under stress. Every exercise required candidates to rapidly assess terrain, enemy dispositions, and mission objectives, then issue orders and move their units immediately. Instructors routinely changed scenarios without warning. A patrol operation might suddenly become a defensive drill. A defensive drill might turn into a hasty attack. A hasty attack might be interrupted by an unexpected flanking threat. The point was to eliminate the idea that battle followed a predictable script. The watchwords were speed, initiative, and action. Failure to act was considered the worst mistake. Officers who hesitated, who sought too much information, or who waited for a perfect solution were criticized harshly. Officers who made bold decisions, even if imperfect, were praised. Marshall's philosophy was simple. In war, indecision kills more soldiers than boldness. This approach produced officers who were comfortable operating with incomplete information and who trusted their judgment. They learned to issue short, concise orders that conveyed intent rather than micromanaging details. They learned to lead from the front, to seize fleeting opportunities, and to coordinate with adjacent units on their own initiative. An officer who could not function this way would not graduate. These methods filtered outward into every corner of the Army's training system. Newly activated divisions practiced constant small unit exercises emphasizing initiative. Platoon leaders were taught to maneuver independently without waiting for battalion guidance. Squad leaders were trained to act even when cut off from their platoons. The Army wanted every soldier, down to the newest private, to understand what the mission was and how to contribute to it without being told exactly what to do. In short, Marshall was creating a culture rather than merely a set of procedures. It was a culture in which aggression was a virtue, hesitation a vice, and decentralized decision-making the norm. This culture would shape American battlefield behavior throughout the war. For better and for worse, its strengths would become evident in the rugged hills of Tunisia, the hedgerows of Normandy, and the dense forests of the Ardennes. Its weaknesses would emerge when inexperienced units launched hasty attacks against well-prepared German defenses. But it made the U.S. Army fundamentally different from any army it fought alongside. Conversely, officers who hesitated, deferred decisions, or clung rigidly to plans were marked as unfit for command. Marshall believed that in modern warfare, delay could be fatal. A culture that rewarded caution over initiative would cost lives and missions. Promotions, assignments, and recognition were all tied to performance under pressure. It's not 2 years of service or adherence to procedure. Over time, this created a self-reinforcing system. Officers learned that decisive action was both expected and rewarded, while passivity was punished. Junior leaders developed confidence in their own judgment and the courage to act without waiting for approval. Units became accustomed to rapid, decentralized decision-making, where initiative at the lowest level could shape the outcome of engagements. The result was a tactical culture unique among the major armies of the time. American soldiers and junior officers internalized the principle that speed, aggression, and improvisation could outweigh numbers or firepower. Initiative became a core value, embedded in training, doctrine, and personnel policy. It was not just a method of fighting, it was a mindset that would define how the United States Army approached combat from North Africa to Normandy and beyond. This culture would be tested repeatedly during the war. At times, it led to brilliant successes, allowing small units to exploit weaknesses in enemy lines and seize objectives that might otherwise have been unattainable. At other times, inexperience or misjudgment resulted in costly mistakes. But even in failure, the underlying philosophy empowerment of junior leaders, aggressive action, and rapid decision-making remained the defining feature of the American Army in World War. The turnaround at Kasserine Pass was a vivid demonstration of the American approach to warfare. Unlike their British allies, who would have paused to regroup and plan, American commanders relied on initiative, speed, and aggressive action to regain the initiative. Junior officers, lieutenants, and captains led counterattacks with whatever forces were immediately available, often without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. Small units maneuvered independently, exploited gaps in German lines, and struck flanks and rear positions to disrupt enemy formations. Marshall's doctrine of immediate counterattack had been put to the test, and it worked. The Germans, who had anticipated a period of American inaction, were thrown off balance by the rapid, relentless assaults. Disorganized units, low on ammunition, and uncertain of American dispositions, were unable to consolidate their gains. What could have become a prolonged defensive struggle turned into a series of local victories that restored American positions within days. The lessons of Counterattack Pass were clear. Training and doctrine emphasizing initiative and offensive action could compensate for inexperience and initial setbacks. Even under conditions of chaos and surprise, units empowered to act decisively could recover, regain momentum, and impose their will on the enemy. Officers who demonstrated boldness were vindicated, while those who hesitated or clung to conventional caution were quickly replaced or sidelined. The success at Counterattack Pass also had a psychological impact. American soldiers and junior leaders gained confidence in their ability to fight, even against a veteran and well-equipped opponent. The doctrine that had been taught at Fort Benning and reinforced in the Louisiana Maneuvers proved its worth under fire. American forces were learning, in real combat, the value of speed, initiative, and aggressive counteraction, the very principles Marshall had instilled before the war began. Within weeks, the U.S. Army in North Africa had begun to shed the reputation of inexperience and timidity. The Battle of Counterattack Pass marked the first clear evidence that Marshall's reforms had created an army capable of learning, adapting, and striking back immediately. Even in the face of superior enemy tactics, the Germans struck through the dense forests of the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied front and capture Antwerp. The initial assault achieved tactical surprise, overwhelming lightly defended American positions and driving deep into the lines. Many units were cut off, communications broke down, and command posts were disrupted. For inexperienced armies, this could have been catastrophic, a repeat of Counterattack Pass on a much larger scale. But the lessons of North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy had been ingrained. Junior officers and NCOs immediately took initiative. Small units organized counterattacks with whatever forces were at hand, striking flanks, interdicting supply routes, and slowing German momentum. Platoons and companies that were isolated did not wait for orders, they improvised, maneuvered, and inflicted damage on advancing forces. Artillery and armor, previously separated by logistical and coordination challenges, were rapidly brought to bear as local commanders adapted to the unfolding crisis. Troops who had been drilled in immediate counterattack responded instinctively, pushing back German spearheads before they could consolidate. The offensive spirit Marshall had, demanded decades earlier at Fort Benning and reinforced during the Louisiana Maneuvers, now defined how the U.S. Army operated under fire. Despite initial chaos and the ferocity of the German attack, American forces stabilized the front and within days began to regain lost ground. Patton's Third Army executed rapid maneuvers, exploiting gaps in German lines, cutting off spearheads, and threatening enemy supply routes. The speed and aggressiveness of the response prevented the German offensive from achieving strategic objectives, ultimately leading to its failure. The Ardennes campaign, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, demonstrated the full maturation of Marshall's tactical doctrine. Immediate action, decentralized decision-making, and relentless counterattack had transformed what could have been a disastrous defeat into a testament to support American resilience and training. Soldiers and officers at every level understood that waiting or hesitation could be fatal. Initiative, aggression, and rapid adaptation were now embedded in the culture of the American Army. By the end of December 1944, the Ardennes campaign had proven that Marshall's vision, cultivated at Fort Benning, tested in North Africa, and refined across multiple theaters, had succeeded in creating an army capable of meeting the challenges of modern mechanized warfare, even against a veteran and highly capable opponent like the Wehrmacht. Second, American junior officers and NCOs exercised initiative at every level. Platoon leaders, lieutenants, and even sergeants did not wait for orders from battalion or division headquarters. They organized ad hoc defenses, coordinated supporting fire, and launched counterattacks with whatever forces were immediately available. Infantry squads flanked German tanks, artillery crews repositioned themselves under fire, and engineers blew bridges to slow the enemy. These rapid, decentralized actions disrupted German momentum and forced local improvisation that the attackers had not anticipated. Third, American units refused to give ground permanently. Even positions that were overrun were quickly retaken by counterattacks within hours. Soldiers had been drilled to act immediately when threatened, to seize the initiative, and to deny the enemy the chance to consolidate gains. Every recovered crossroads, every village retaken, and every stalled armored column contributed to stabilizing the front and buying critical time for reinforcements to arrive. The cumulative effect of these actions was decisive. The German advance, initially unstoppable, began to slow. The bulge into the Allied line ceased to widen. Key bridges and supply routes were defended long enough to allow fresh American and British forces to mobilize. Rapid counterattacks, aggressive local initiative, and relentless pressure on the advancing Germans disrupted their timetable, prevented the capture of Antwerp, and ultimately doomed the offensive. The Battle of the Yard, the Battle of the Yard, the Battle of the Bulge was a dramatic demonstration of Marshall's pre-war vision realized in combat. Small unit initiative, decentralized command, and aggressive counterattack. Ingrained through years of training and doctrine, allowed the U.S. Army to absorb a surprise assault, recover rapidly, and turn a near-catastrophic situation into a strategic defensive success. Patton smiled. "We'll be ready in 48 hours, he said matter-of-factly. His confidence was rooted not in luck, but in doctrine and training. Rapid maneuver, aggressive action, and decentralized execution. Moving the Third Army northward was a logistical nightmare. But it was precisely the kind of operation Marshall's reforms had prepared American forces to execute. Staff officers pored over maps, routing supply convoys, coordinating fuel and ammunition, and establishing lines of communication to keep units moving. Units already engaged in offensive operations accelerated their pace, improvising as necessary to maintain momentum. Within hours, Patton's Corps' commanders were issuing orders. Divisions in the south, some still in contact with enemy forces, pivoted north. Tank columns raced along snow-covered roads. Artillery batteries shifted positions to provide supporting. Fires and infantry units conducted forced marches while maintaining combat readiness. Every echelon from company commanders to corps staff exercised initiative, adapting to unforeseen obstacles without waiting for permission. By the morning of December 21st, the first elements of Third Army were moving into position to strike the German flank. This rapid redeployment, covering 100 miles in freezing winter conditions, while maintaining unit cohesion and combat readiness, was unprecedented. It showcased the U.S. Army's capacity for operational mobility and aggressive maneuver, a product of the doctrine Marshall had instilled 2 decades earlier. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Devers watched as the American system they had overseen in training and operations came alive under fire. Units were not merely reacting, they were exploiting opportunity. The U.S. Army was fighting as Marshall had envisioned, bold, flexible, and decisive, turning a German surprise offensive into a counterattack that would ultimately collapse the Bulge and restore the front. The Ardennes campaign would become the ultimate proof of American tactical culture, an army trained to act immediately, to take initiative at every level, and to strike decisively, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds. The combination of small unit counterattacks and large-scale maneuver demonstrated that doctrine. Training and culture were not theoretical. They could win battles and shape the course of a campaign. By the morning of December 23rd, the Third Army was in motion. Columns of tanks, trucks, and artillery rumbled north through snow-covered roads, while infantry units marched in extended formations, maintaining readiness in case of enemy contact. Radio operators relayed updates continuously, adjusting routes as units encountered obstacles or congestion. Junior commanders made decisions on the fly, redirecting supply convoys, adjusting the timing of attacks, and coordinating with adjacent units saw without waiting for higher headquarters to micromanage. Every echelon of command acted on initiative. Regiment and battalion commanders interpreted the intent of the operation and adapted it to their immediate circumstances. Platoon leaders pressed forward even when roads were blocked or enemy elements threatened their flanks. Supply officers, understanding the critical need for fuel and ammunition at the point of attack, rerouted convoys, requisitioned local resources, and ensured that artillery and armored units remained operational. Artillery crews prepared firing positions in advance, anticipating the exact time their support would be needed to cover infantry and tank advances. This extraordinary level of decentralized coordination and rapid action turned what British and German planners deemed impossible into reality. In just under 72 hours, 3 fully engaged divisions had pivoted 90 north, repositioned hundreds of vehicles and guns, and prepared to strike the German flank. Patton's ability to execute. This maneuver was a direct result of Marshall's pre-war reforms. Officers and staff had been trained to understand intent, take initiative, improvise under pressure, and act decisively without waiting for explicit orders. The Third Army's movement demonstrated the culmination of 2 decades of doctrinal development, a culture of aggressive action, rapid decision-making, and decentralized execution capable of achieving what seemed tactically impossible. By December 24th, Patton's forces were in position, poised to strike into the German flank. The stage was set for a counterattack that would turn the tide of the Ardennes offensive, validating Marshall's vision of an army built to act swiftly, think independently, and exploit opportunity at every level. American forces in Bastogne embodied the principles Marshall had instilled decades earlier. Every platoon, company, and battalion understood the commander's intent: hold the town and deny the enemy freedom of movement. But do not simply wait to be destroyed or rescued. Small unit leaders took initiative, launching counterattacks whenever gaps or weaknesses appeared in the German lines. Snipers, engineers, and infantry squads conducted aggressive patrols to harass supply lines and disrupt German formations. Artillery crews, often under direct threat, positioned themselves to deliver rapid, responsive fire in support of these local offensive actions. The result was chaos for the Germans. Units expecting passive defenders found themselves repeatedly counterattacked, forced to redeploy into combat formations, and slowed by continuous American pressure. Even outnumbered 3-1, the defenders of Bastogne created operational friction, delaying the German timetable and buying critical time for Patton's Third Army to arrive. This relentless, aggressive defense illustrated a core tenet of American doctrine: initiative at the lowest level, immediate counterattack, and refusal to concede ground unless absolutely necessary. It also highlighted the culture of junior leaders empowered to make decisions without waiting for higher headquarters. Lieutenants and captains did not wait for orders. They acted, improvised, and coordinated locally, knowing that bold action, even under overwhelming odds, was the expectation. By December 25th, the German offensive into the Ardennes was faltering. Bastogne remained in American hands, and Patton's forces were advancing rapidly to relieve the town. The combination of small unit initiative, decentralized command, large-scale operational maneuver demonstrated the full maturation of Marshall's pre-war reforms. What had been drilled at Fort Benning and tested in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy was now shaping the outcome of the largest German offensive on the Western Front. These localized counterattacks were emblematic of the American approach: act decisively, strike the enemy before they consolidate, and seize the initiative at the lowest possible level. Across the Bastogne perimeter, small unit leaders, lieutenants, captains, and sergeants exercised judgment independently, coordinating fire, maneuver, and assaults without waiting for detailed instructions from battalion or division headquarters. American artillery, infantry, and armor worked in close coordination, responding rapidly to changing situations. When German units attempted to regroup or bring up reinforcements, American forces struck again, exploiting gaps and sowing confusion. Even when outnumbered or facing superior firepower, local commanders understood that bold, immediate action could impose friction on the enemy and prevent operational success. The counterattack at Marvy was not unique. It was repeated across the perimeter dozens of times each day. Snipers targeted enemy officers. Engineers demolished fortified positions. Tanks advanced to cover infantry movements, and platoons executed flanking maneuvers without waiting for centralized orders. Each successful action reinforced the culture of initiative, teaching soldiers that hesitation could be more dangerous than risk. By maintaining continuous offensive pressure, even while surrounded, American forces bought critical time for reinforcements to arrive. Every counterattack disrupted German planning, slowed their advance, and prevented them from achieving the rapid breakthroughs necessary for operational success. Bastogne remained in American hands not because of sheer numbers or firepower alone, but because the soldiers and junior leaders acted decisively, aggressively, and in accordance with the doctrine Marshall had instilled years before, across the Bastogne perimeter. Every unit from parachute infantry to artillery batteries exemplified the principles of aggressive, decentralized action. Battalion and company commanders assessed threats in real time, choosing when and where to strike, while platoon and squad leaders executed those decisions immediately. The result was a constantly shifting, unpredictable defense that frustrated the Germans at every turn. Artillery played a particularly decisive role. American doctrine emphasized speed, concentration, and flexibility. Batteries like the 969th Field Artillery Battalion massed fires rapidly, shifted targets on short notice, and often fired dangerously close to friendly positions to halt enemy advances. Commanders made decisions locally, trusting that subordinate units understood the mission and could adapt to unfolding conditions. This willingness to accept calculated, risk-friendly casualties from danger close. Fire was a hallmark of American tactical thinking. It was better to act decisively than to hesitate and allow the enemy to consolidate. Meanwhile, infantry units maintained continuous offensive pressure. Night raids, ambushes, and counterattacks disrupted German logistics and command efforts. German units could never mass overwhelming force because American forces struck first, struck fast, and struck unpredictably. Small unit initiative amplified the effect of numerical inferiority. The defense of Bastogne was, in effect, a textbook application of Marshall's pre-war reforms and Fort Benning training philosophy. Junior leaders were empowered to act independently. Units coordinated locally without waiting for higher headquarters. And aggression, speed, and initiative were valued above rigid adherence to procedure. By sustaining continuous offensive action, even while surrounded, American forces bought critical time, imposed friction on the enemy, and set the stage for Patton's approaching Third Army to exploit the German vulnerabilities. This mindset initiative at every level transformed the defense of Bastogne from a desperate holding action into a dynamic, offensive-minded defense. Every soldier understood that inaction could be fatal, and that bold, timely action could shape the outcome of an engagement. Machine gunners, riflemen, and mortarmen were trained to look for targets, exploit weaknesses, and harass enemy movements. Squad and platoon leaders coordinated ambushes, raids, and flanking maneuvers without waiting for permission, ensuring that the Germans were never allowed to consolidate their gains. American armor moved in concert with infantry, constantly repositioning and engaging targets before the enemy could respond. Artillery delivered immediate responsive fires, often under extreme risk, synchronized with infantry and tank actions. The result was a highly adaptive, resilient force that could absorb attacks, counterattack, and maintain operational momentum even while encircled. This was exactly what Marshall had intended decades earlier at Fort Benning. Training at every level, from basic recruit instruction to advanced officer, courses emphasized thinking. It's not rote following of orders. Soldiers and leaders were taught to understand the commander's intent and take decisive action within that framework. Adaptability, speed, and aggression were reinforced as core values. Bastogne illustrated the full maturation of that doctrine. American forces did not merely react to the German moves, they shaped the battlefield, dictated the tempo of combat, turned a seemingly hopeless situation into a delaying and attritional campaign that would buy time for relief forces. The siege of Bastogne thus stands as a testament to the power of a tactical culture built on initiative, aggressive action, and decentralized decision-making, a culture that allowed American forces to succeed against numerically superior, well-equipped, and experienced German attackers. The relief of Bastogne did not signal a pause. American forces immediately exploited the corridor to launch offensive operations against the German flanks and rear. Units that had spent 6 days under siege seamlessly shifted from defensive action to aggressive maneuver. Tank columns surged forward, infantry moved to clear surrounding villages, and artillery pushed forward to support the advancing troops. Lieutenant Charles Boggs and Cobra King became symbols of this offensive spirit. As the lead elements moved through the narrow corridor under fire, small unit leaders seized every opportunity to strike at enemy positions, disrupt supply lines, and secure key terrain. Engineers repaired roads and bridges on the move, enabling follow-on forces to maintain momentum. Every echelon from platoon to division acted on initiative, improvising when necessary to keep the German forces off balance. The Germans, already strained by continuous local counterattacks and the unexpected relief of Bastogne, could not recover. American units pressed relentlessly, combining small unit aggression with coordinated large-scale maneuvers. The same principles that had allowed them to survive while surrounded immediate counterattack, decentralized decision-making, an initiative at every level now fueled the broader offensive to push the enemy back. By December 27th, the American advance had begun to collapse the German Bulge, restoring the front and forcing the Wehrmacht onto the defensive. The Ardennes campaign thus became a striking demonstration of the full maturation of Marshall's doctrine. Soldiers and leaders trained to think, act decisively, and exploit opportunity could not only withstand surprise attacks, but turn them into operational victory. The rapid recovery and offensive tempo of American units during the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the full effect of Marshall's doctrine in combat. Soldiers and junior leaders had been trained to act decisively, exploit opportunities, and maintain momentum regardless of prior losses or exhaustion. The 101st Airborne, emerging from 6 days of siege in Bastogne, exemplified this mindset. They transitioned seamlessly from desperate defense to aggressive offense. Maintaining pressure on German forces and preventing them from regrouping, this cycle attacked, defend, counterattack, attack again occurred, continuously across the Ardennes. Decisions were made at the lowest levels. Platoon and company commanders empowered to act without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. Logistics and artillery adapted on the move, reinforcing units were needed, often improvising under extreme conditions. The result was relentless pressure on German formations that undermined their ability to consolidate, resupply, or maneuver effectively. By contrast, British and Canadian forces operating in the northern sector adhered to a more deliberate approach. Even after repelling German attacks, units paused to reorganize, establish strong defensive positions, and coordinate carefully prepared counteroffensives. This method reduced risk and preserved forces, but lacked the speed and shock effect of American operations. Where the Allies needed days to recover and plan, American units often regained the initiative within hours. By January 25, 1945, just 41 days after the German offensive began, American forces had eliminated the Bulge, restored the front line, and inflicted catastrophic losses on the Wehrmacht. Estimates placed German casualties between 85,000 and 100,000, a combination of killed, wounded, and captured. The success of American forces in the Ardennes was not accidental. It was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of doctrinal development, training reforms, and a culture of initiative, aggressive action, and decentralized decision-making. The Battle of the Bulge confirmed that Marshall's vision had succeeded, an army built to think, act, and fight aggressively at every level could survive surprise, exploit opportunity, and achieve decisive results even against a formidable and determined enemy. The Battle of the Bulge illustrated the costs and benefits of American doctrine. Casualties were high: 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing, but the decisive outcome demonstrated the effectiveness of aggressive, continuous offensive action. American forces achieved results far beyond what could have been expected given the surprise, harsh conditions, and numerical superiority of the German attackers. The principles that produced this success: initiative at every level, decisive action with incomplete information, immediate counterattack, and relentless offensive. Pressure were the same principles George Marshall had instilled at Fort Benning in the 1920s, and later codified in Field Manual 102.5, soldiers and officers trained to act independently, to seize opportunity, and to maintain momentum under pressure, had turned what could have been a catastrophic defeat into a strategic victory. After the war, the U.S. Army conducted extensive analysis of combat operations in Europe. The findings validated Marshall's approach. Units that acted aggressively and continuously often achieved objectives faster and with fewer cumulative casualties than those that adhered to cautious, methodical procedures. Training that emphasized initiative and rapid decision-making produced more adaptive, effective combat units. Decentralized command, empowering leaders at the lowest levels, created flexibility that allowed forces to respond quickly to changing circumstances. These lessons became embedded in American military culture and doctrine long after. 1945, from Korea to Vietnam. The Gulf War to Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. forces continued to emphasize offensive action, rapid exploitation, and immediate counterattack. Modern infantry field manuals still teach that the best response to ambush is to assault through it. An operational philosophy rooted in the aggressive, initiative-driven culture Marshall established decades earlier. The Battle of the Bulge, Bastogne, and the broader campaigns of World War II were therefore not just victories of strategy and equipment, they were victories of doctrine, training, and a military culture built to act decisively, think independently, and fight relentlessly. American forces had learned to seize the initiative, and that lesson would define the Army for generations to come. The basic question was simple. When faced with uncertainty and enemy action, what should a unit do? American doctrine, shaped by Marshall, answered decisively: act immediately. Take the initiative. Exploit every opportunity. Counterattack without delay. Maintain offensive momentum. British, French, and even Soviet doctrine answered differently: consolidate, assess, coordinate, and prepare before acting. Both approaches sought to reduce risk and maximize effectiveness. But only the American approach prioritized speed, initiative, and aggressive action at all levels. What happened at Bastogne and throughout the Ardennes was the cumulative effect of this philosophy. Every soldier, from private to battalion commander, understood that the default response to pressure was action, not hesitation. Opportunities were seized as soon as they appeared. Mistakes were tolerated if they were the result of initiative. Indecision was punished. This culture of aggressive, decentralized decision-making was the direct product of decades of training, innovation, and doctrinal refinement initiated by Marshall in the 1920s and reinforced in exercises, campaigns, and officer schools leading up to and during World War II. The success of Bastogne illustrated that doctrine is more than a set of written instructions. It is a culture, a set of expectations, and a way of thinking that shapes behavior under fire. American forces did not merely survive, they dominated, not because of luck or superior numbers, but because they had been trained to fight in a way that leveraged speed, initiative, and continuous offensive action. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a testament to the enduring power of well-conceived doctrine applied. Consistently across all levels of command, the contrast was stark. British and Soviet forces emphasized deliberate preparation, concentration of force, and careful coordination. Success came from overwhelming power and meticulous planning. But it required time to organize, time to assess, time to execute. The Americans operated differently. Their doctrine demanded immediate action, decentralized decision-making, and relentless offensive pressure. Speed and initiative, not sheer mass or meticulous planning, were the keys to effectiveness. German commanders quickly learned the consequences. A tactical victory against an American unit was often temporary. The moment a position was lost or a unit routed, American forces counterattacked, sometimes with the same troops, sometimes with reinforcements already on the move. Nothing remained static. Defensive positions were short-lived. Opportunities were immediately exploited. And the enemy was kept constantly off balance. The cumulative effect was devastating. German units could rarely rest, reorganize, or consolidate their gains. Exhaustion mounted, supply lines became vulnerable, and morale suffered. Skilled German officers repeatedly remarked in after-action reports that American forces were uniquely difficult to fight. They never stopped attacking. Against a resource-limited enemy, this relentless pressure compounded every logistical and operational weakness, demonstrating that in mobile warfare, speed and initiative could outweigh numerical or positional advantage. The lesson was clear. Doctrine is not just about what you do, it shapes how your enemy responds, how momentum is seized, and how battles are won. The American approach created a battlefield reality in which hesitation was punished, and aggression became the force multiplier that defined victory. The contrast between the Eastern and Western fronts highlights the operational impact of doctrine and organization. On the Eastern Front, German units could anticipate Soviet offensives. The sheer scale of the attacks, millions of men, thousands of tanks, massive artillery barrages meant that preparation, entrenchment, and careful channeling could inflict heavy losses, even if the Germans could not stop the advance. The timing and location of Soviet attacks were often predictable, allowing the Wehrmacht to concentrate defenses and execute methodical countermeasures. On the Western Front, the Americans operated differently. They never paused to mass for a single, decisive offensive. Instead, they attacked continuously, unpredictably, and everywhere at once. Infantry, armor, and artillery moved in concert, striking wherever opportunity presented itself. German commanders never knew whether the next attack would come from a platoon on a flank, a regiment in a forest, or a division crossing an open plain. The operational tempo, combined with relentless offensive pressure, created chaos, disrupted logistics, and prevented the enemy from consolidating forces. This approach relied on three uniquely American advantages. Industrial production. The U.S. could supply vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and spare parts, sustaining constant operations without pause, population, and manpower. Large numbers of trained replacements ensured that units could absorb casualties and maintain operational momentum. Training and doctrine. Soldiers and officers were educated to act independently, understand the commander's intent, and make rapid decisions without waiting for detailed instructions from higher headquarters. It was the combination of these factors, relentless operational tempo, decentralized initiative, and unparalleled material support that made American forces on the Western Front uniquely difficult to defeat. German units could neither predict nor contain their attacks, and over time, this constant pressure compounded every operational weakness in the Wehrmacht. Accelerating the collapse of German resistance in the West, Patton's death was a loss to the army, but his legacy was inseparable from the success of American forces in World War II. He embodied the aggressive, initiative-driven culture that Marshall had cultivated, bold, decisive, and relentless in action. The victories from Normandy to the Elbe were not simply the result of superior numbers or equipment. They were the outcome of a doctrine and training system that produced leaders and soldiers capable of acting independently, exploiting opportunity, and maintaining continuous pressure on the enemy. Marshall's understanding of America's unique advantages, industrial capacity, manpower, and the ability to train adaptive leaders shaped a military that could execute operations on a scale and tempo that Germany could not match. By May 1945, the Wehrmacht had been destroyed. Millions of German soldiers had been captured or killed. Key cities and strategic positions had fallen. And through it all, American forces had maintained the offensive, applied pressure relentlessly, and never allowed the enemy to pause, recover, or regain the initiative. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous one-word reply at Bastogne, "Nuts," was not a fluke of temperament. It was the natural expression of a military culture forged by decades of deliberate doctrinal innovation. Soldiers and commanders had been trained from the outset to act aggressively, seize the initiative, and maintain momentum under pressure. Across the battlefields of Europe, from North Africa to the Ardennes, this culture of offensive action and empowered its decision-making proved decisive. Marshall's vision had been realized, an army designed to think, act, and fight with speed, initiative, and relentless aggression, capable of defeating any opponent through doctrine as much as through firepower. It was a triumph of planning, training, and culture in enduring. Lesson in the power of doctrine applied consistently at every level of command. Marshall's legacy is measured, not only in the battles won or the soldiers trained, but in the enduring culture of initiative, speed, and aggression he instilled in the United States Army. The rapid relief of Bastogne became legendary, a textbook example of operational agility and bold execution studied in military academies worldwide. Eisenhower's handling of the Ardennes, offensive seeing opportunity where others saw. Disaster demonstrated how deeply these principles had permeated American military thinking at the highest levels. Marshall's influence extended beyond the battlefield. As Secretary of State, he designed the Marshall Plan, reshaping post-war Europe and earning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. Yet, his most profound contribution remained the tactical doctrine he had developed at Fort Benning in the 1920s and implemented Army-wide during the 1940s. That doctrine seized the initiative, maintain offensive action, counterattack immediately, empower junior leaders, accept risk and uncertainty, and use speed and aggression to overcome superior forces was decisive in battles from North Africa to the Ardennes. These principles saved Bastogne. They won the Battle of the Bulge. They contributed decisively to Allied victory in Europe. And they continue to guide American military operations today. A testament to Marshall's vision that effective doctrine is not written merely on paper, but embedded in the minds and actions of soldiers at every level of command. 75 years later, the lessons of Bastogne and the Ardennes remain as relevant as ever. Initiative, speed, and relentless offense are the keys to battlefield success. That is how military innovation truly happens. Not through advanced technology or sheer numbers alone, though both certainly help, but through clear thinking about the kind of war you must fight, the advantages you possess, and the doctrine that allows you to exploit them effectively. It happens through training systems that instill that doctrine at every level, from private to general. And it happens through leaders willing to challenge conventional wisdom and implement bold new approaches. If you found this account meaningful, please like this video. It helps us share more essential chapters from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans continents and generations, united by a shared commitment to understanding how history continues to shape the present.